I am Christopher Potter, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mock,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Christopher Potter.
Essence, Book 1, Septima, the first volume in the exciting new science fiction series by Nick Breaker. Troy is no longer himself. Kidnapped by aliens infected with the essence of the dead General Tomas, Troy grasps at his only hope of survival. He merges his soul with the alien parasite trying to possess him, leaving him forever changed, and not entirely for the worse. Once plagued by crippling phobias, Troy is now fearless, willing to fight his enemies with his bare hands. But with his new strength also comes a new weakness: women. Tomas was notorious for his insatiable desires, and Troy finds himself constantly resisting temptation, especially the gorgeous, manipulative Alta. Although Alta has convinced the Pyrrhans she's helping them prepare to battle the murderous Reptarans, she's actually meticulously planning to steal their ultimate power source and then abandon them to their fate. Alta won't hesitate to kill anyone in her way, and her deep love for Tomas is Troy's only advantage. He convinces Alta that Tomas has taken full control of his being and thus keeps her trust and his life. While Alta schemes, Troy covertly struggles to save the Pyrrhans and prevent the Reptarans from invading Earth. But first he must wrest back control of his own soul. Essence, Book 1, Septima, the first volume in the exciting new science fiction series by Nick Breaker. Find it on Amazon today. There's a link in the show notes. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Christopher Potter on the show with me today. Christopher has a brand new book out. It's been out for a couple of weeks now. It's called The Earth Gazers on Seeing Ourselves, and a lot of you may have seen me post on Instagram, me flipping through this book. It is absolutely gorgeous. And, for a science fiction and a space kind of nerd like I've been my whole life, this book is an essential read. So welcome to the show, Christopher.
Thank you very much. I look forward to talking to you.
Yeah, I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
Well, actually, I've come to writing very late in life because I was actually an editor for most of my life, and I had an editor of a mixture of fiction and non-fiction. But my background was actually in mathematics, so I didn't have much, certainly no writing experience. Though I read voraciously, and I suppose I always thought I was going to end up writing, and I think I did have a kind of idea that it would take me until I was fairly late on in life before I had anything to say. And so after a career in publishing of about 25 years, I left, and this is now my third book.
Wow. You said you were a voracious reader when you were young. What sorts of books really captured your imagination?
Well, as a child, I sort of read all the sort of classics, like, I don't know, the Narnia Chronicles, the C.S. Lewis and Joan Aitken, and there was a series that was supposedly fronted by Alfred Hitchcock. Do you remember that? It was called Solve Them Yourself Mysteries.
Yes.
I read science fiction, though I haven't read much recently, I have to admit. And then I went on to the classics and Jane Austen and anything, really. In those early days, you just kind of read everything, don't you? You read the back of the cereal packet. And,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, hairspray bottles, wherever you are, that you just pick it up and devour.
Yeah.
You said that you were initially really interested in mathematics. What do you think it was about that intrigued you?
Well, I continue to have a real passion for music, and they often say that music and mathematics go together, and that does seem to be something in that.
Especially if you start parsing out music theory, then for sure.
Yeah. And I like puzzles, and I still love doing number puzzles and cryptic word puzzles, and so mathematics just seemed like, a lot of fun, that you could actually do this to study, and you didn't have to write essays or read anything that you didn't want to read unless it was for your own pleasure. It seemed ideal for me, so I enjoyed it. And actually, once I started doing it, much to my surprise, I kind of got interested in the more applied end of mathematics. So I studied things like relativity theory and quantum physics, and that got me interested in the philosophy and kind of what mathematics was all about and how it could be used. So I then ended up going back to university and reading about history and philosophy of science. I guess after the 25-year interlude of editing that I came back to that, because the 3 books I've written are in a way all about the history and philosophy of science. So come full circle.
I'm most fascinated by people's circuitous route to how they arrive where they are, and all of the intermediate steps that no one ever plans on. But when you look back on them, all of those steps are absolutely necessary, and you can trace the progression. I absolutely love that.
I know, it's odd, isn't it? You can only really tell that life has a story in retrospect. At the time, it just seems random and chaotic, doesn't it? You don't really think that you're planning anything.
Exactly.
If only you, one might be a little more relaxed about things.
Oh, if only wisdom and youth came together.
Yeah, right.
So what got you into editing?
Desperation, I think. I read mathematics and thought, well, now what do I do with it? And thought that, oh, God, I probably have to become an accountant or something. And I tried that, and I was absolutely hopeless at it. I realized I had no real interest in the workings of money or economics. And my other passion, as I said, was reading. And I amazingly found a job. There was I was living in London, and there was a column in The Guardian on Mondays that advertised jobs in the media. It was called Creative and Media. It doesn't exist anymore. It was a whole page of adverts in the days when you used to scour newspapers to look for something you could apply to. And I saw this job that seemed to be offering a surprisingly small amount of money, though they were expecting quite a lot of experience. And I thought, oh, well, perhaps no one will apply. And I applied without the requisite experience. It just turned out that my hunch was right, and I think I was one of 2 people who'd applied, and I got the job. And I kind of just stayed. I sort of hung around.
What sorts of things were you editing?
It was a job for editing. It was very, very dull. It was editing a whole series of revision books for people taking what in England were called O&A levels. So they were the exams you took at age 15 and 17, before you then went on to university or left school or did whatever you did then. And so they covered every subject from geography to history, mathematics. And I suppose that was why I got the job, because I had this slightly odd thing of being passionate about literature and science. So that was... And then I have to say, for the first 3 years in publishing, I thought, I'm never going to get anywhere in this industry because everybody's quite old. They've all been here all their lives. Nobody's moving. And then suddenly it was just it was sort of where you can't really plan your life because everything changed overnight. Suddenly all the companies started buying each other and they conglomerized, and people left, people were fired. And suddenly I was in the right place at the right time and got a new job, and things changed. So I'm always rather doubtful when people say, oh, publishing, it's not what it used to be and it's dying. And people have been saying that certainly for the 30 years that I've been around in that industry. So I feel quite sanguine that publishing's okay.
What do you, well, it seems like once you kind of get into the machinery, there's no telling where it might wind up.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I've talked to a lot of editors, and they've given some similar answers before. Like, you know, when you're surrounded by books and storytelling so much, I always find it fascinating when they say, "Oh, I mean, I can edit it, but I can't write stories. The ideas don't come to me the way they do, you know, writers, or I don't have anything to say."
Yeah.
When did you feel like that changed for you?
Well, actually, in this kind of classic way for editors, where you are looking for someone to write a particular book, and you keep sounding out particular authors, and they say, "Oh, yes, it's a really good idea, but it's not for me." And then suddenly you think, "Oh, perhaps I should write that book." And that's exactly what happened with me. I published a lot of fiction writers, but I also published science writers that interested me. So I published things like Longitude, the David Sobel, and a book about proving Fermat's last theorem that turned out to be a best-selling book, and things like that, a book on Newton, all kinds of things. But I thought I want to write a kind of all-encompassing book about, for people who don't normally read science books, who normally read novels, but might want to know a bit more about science, but don't want to read the kind of books that are on offer. So I wanted to try and do something a bit more literary, if I can say that, of what I was trying to do, and kind of covered all the ground, you know, sort of a history, and tried to place us as human beings in the scale of the universe, just to give an idea of the different scales at which science works, from the very smallest quantum level to the edges of the universe, and what that even means, so that there are edges to the visible universe. And I wrote, that was my first book, You Are Here.
And so that kind of began as a thought experiment to try to define what it is to be us, but to present that in a way that was accessible to the layman.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, I was so nervous about not thinking that I could write at all that I didn't even present my original proposal as a written, in a normal kind of written document. It was more like a chart that you folded out, that had a line of time and dimensions of space that I thought I could somehow overlap from the Big Bang to the end of the universe in time scale, and from the very smallest quantum things to the largest ideas of the visible universe at the other end. And then I quickly realized, once somebody actually commissioned the thing, that wasn't going to work, and that I'd actually have to write. And so for quite a long time, I was worried about writing sentences. And it wasn't until I worked out the structure of the book and how to do it that I kind of forgot that I couldn't write, because I was too busy writing the thing to worry about that.
Exactly. In the writing of it, were there any conscious steps that you took to make it more literary, to borrow your term, to not have it turn out as a dusty textbook, but as an engaging narrative on the science behind the universe?
Yes, I've always been interested in collecting quirky facts about the world and biographies. And that's something that is actually particularly true of the current book. I wanted to write a book about the space race, but I also wanted to take a longer arc, and so I was going to write about a certain number of characters that I would try and do as integrated biographies. So I was always looking for the telling fact, or the telling sort of biographical detail. And I did that to some degree in the first book. Yeah, I did. I did. I had lots of mini biographies of scientists and tried to find some interesting, amusing story to weave in. Yeah.
From that first book you wrote, where you expanded on the wide open universe, your second book took a much smaller scale, didn't it?
Not really. The first book led me to think that I was kind of ending up in thinking about consciousness and culture, but I didn't really dwell on it. I just thought that I could write a second book that was more about the oddness of being a human being. So I suppose the first book I was starting with space and time and ending up with humans. I thought it would be interesting to write more about the peculiar disjunction between being a human being and the scientific method. And I did it in an odd way, where I collected lots and lots of quotes from artists and writers and scientists and wrote my own paragraphs, but it's all numbered. There are actually numbered paragraphs, and so you can read it as a narrative. And the way I did that was I wanted to kind of write something that could be read very fast, but also dense, because I hate those books that say on the one hand and on the other hand, and then you can't think, well, I actually want a third or fourth point, but I've only got two hands, so I don't know how to do this. So I would put things that were disjunctive together and then it would be up to the reader to fill in the gap in between, if that makes any sense at all, which it probably doesn't.
No, absolutely.
Right.
So, when in writing those first two books, when did you realize that you were an author? You talked about being so distracted in writing that you forgot that you weren't a writer. When did it kind of dawn on you that you had switched hats?
I'm still wary of saying I'm a writer. I always think of the story about Stephen Spender. The poet was introduced to T.S. Eliot, and T.S. Eliot said, "Oh, what do you do?" And Stephen Spender said, "I'm a poet." And T.S. Eliot said, "Oh, I could never call myself a poet. I just say I write poetry." And I think of it in the same way. I think I could never say I'm a writer. It seems so grandiose. So I just think I'm still trying to write and see how it goes. Each book. I suppose there are writers come from kind of two different directions, don't they? There are those that know a lot of stuff and they want to pass that on. And then there are people more like me who actually really want to find out stuff. So I'm always writing to try and find out things. So.
Well, I've heard it said before that to truly learn something, then you need to teach someone that. Yeah. And I have found that same thing, that when I really desperately want to know the inner workings of something, then I seek to break it down so that I could share it with someone else. And somehow in the breaking that apart, it becomes kind of part of who you are. And I love that analogy. I love that someone else thinks the same way that I do.
And do you teach, in fact? Is that something you do?
Well, I have throughout the years, and I don't currently, but yes, and I have found that to be true for sure.
Because interestingly, it's actually something I thought about too. I think perhaps that would be something I would like, a direction I'd like to go in the future. But I'm not entirely sure. Whenever I ask people, they say, "Oh God, it's hell! Don't do that." But I must say I like that idea for exactly the reason you say. And I also like to try and move. I love this period of writing where the boundaries between genres are so fluid. And so I'm kind of amazed that I've actually written the kind of books that I've written, because I would never read them myself for pleasure. They're just not the kind of things I would read. I always read fiction. And so I suppose I'm, again, having started thinking, well, God, can I even write? And now I feel a bit more confident that I can do that. Then I suppose I feel like I'm trying to edge across to blend genres, or possibly even write something that I could call a novel. So I find myself reading things that are called novels but are very odd novels, like Zaybolt's Rings of Saturn. That book?
Yes.
Yeah, which I love things like that, where you can't really tell.
One thing I've noticed, Christopher, is that great writers have this kind of odd humility about them, and you can't even talk about it yourself. I think you have someone else has to talk about it for you. Else humility goes out the window.
Yes.
But
I publicity. Not that I feel I'm particularly humble, but I mean, it is awful talking about one's own things.
It is. But I remember watching a movie, and I can't even recall what movie it was now. But there was a writer who was one of the main protagonists, and he had crafted this novel, and he just thought it was the best thing ever. And he turned it into his editor, and he said, "This is my best ever," and it completely flopped. Mm-hmm. And then he went back to the drawing board and he really wrestled over a story. And when he turned it into his editor, he said, this is horrible. It will never be anything. And that was the breakout success. And I think we've all met writers who really become full of themselves. And you can, if you look back over their body of work, you can usually tell where the shift happens. And it's usually when they start kind of believing their own publicity. And so I love that little healthy dose of, I don't know this. I'm not even really supposed to be doing this.
Yes. But I remember quite often writers, not necessarily, this isn't a story about anybody being arrogant, but I remember Michael Cunningham, who is incredibly charming and very modest, but I remember him feeling with some despair after writing 3 or 4 novels that he would just have to write something really personal and peculiar that was just something he'd always wanted to do but just thought it had no legs. And that was The Hours, and that turned out to be his breakout book. And that often happens too, I think, that you have to get away from the idea of feeling you're writing for an audience, that you have to write it for yourself. And so there's that odd thing of being so private in the whole period of writing, and then this horrible, again, a word I've already used once, disjunctive moment or like a quantum leap where you have to go from the private to the public, where you have to hand it over. And I think sometimes when that early experience has been very private, oddly the public can somehow tell and embrace that. Well, that seems to be my experience anyway.
Yeah, I agree. But that brings us to your latest book, The Earth Gazers, on seeing ourselves. This book is really fascinating to me. I was born in 1971, so I completely missed the space race for all intents and purposes. I know that we had a couple of other moon missions up until 1972, but I was too young to have had any appreciation for that. But as a toddler, I distinctly remember watching, I guess it was documentaries or some special news programs where they re-showed some of that footage. And I distinctly remember sitting in front of, a black and white television and watching these rockets launch off and feeling this exhilaration from that and feeling that, this was something deep inside me that connected to this desire to know more about who we are and to get off this blue marble that we're on. Yes. And it's been a lifelong fascination of mine. The mid '80s when, that movie, The Right Stuff, came off. Yeah. I probably, watched it 100 times on VHS and probably wore out a VHS tape.
Yeah.
And so when
a shame that I come from rather the opposite direction, but the dedication to my book is to my father, because he got me up. I was actually age 10 when the moon landing happened, and I was so mystified, and we were looking at this fuzzy black and white image, and I had no idea what it was supposed to be, and I was so bored, and my father got more and more angry with me, but now I feel rather ashamed that I missed. But then I discovered that Neil Armstrong's son had exactly the same experience. He was, I think he must be about the same age as me, and he was watching the television at the same time, and he said, but where is he? And because the image, television wasn't, and that kind of film footage in those days was very poor quality. You didn't really know what you were looking at.
Well, this tells the very interesting story of humans getting off the planet, from taking flight up to where we are now. And it's really sort of a mind-boggling exercise when you start thinking about that we are, in essence, a generation away from the people, maybe 2 generations, however that breaks down, from the people that first saw the planet from another place. What was your initial reasoning for starting to explore the story, and what were some of the things that you discovered that you didn't expect to discover?
Yeah, well, I couldn't be more surprised that I ended up writing a history of rockets, but it started from this idea of perspective, and I was thinking about the first 2 books and what was it that I seemed to be interested in, and it was this idea of our relationship to ourselves and how we look out at the world, but we don't really know who we are as individuals because we don't see ourselves, but we see other people. And then I was just thinking, oh, well, there must have been a moment when collectively human species saw itself, and I thought, oh yeah, then when they were in space, and I thought, well, when was that? And it was clear that there was an actual day on which it happened, and it was December the 21st, 1968, and it was 50 years ago this year. And then I looked, and it said only 24 human beings had ever had that experience, and I thought, well, that can't be right. And indeed, it is correct. It was only those Apollo astronauts who went to the moon who ever got far enough away from the Earth to see the Earth as a sphere in space. And I find that absolutely astonishing. Obviously, when we go to the moon again or further, then that number will change. But for 50 years, almost 50 years, only 24 people have had that experience. And also, we hadn't seen the Earth. We didn't know what the Earth looked like from the outside. We could have guessed pretty well. There'd only been satellite images the year before, in 1967, and they weren't terribly good pictures. We got so used now to all those images of the Earth, beautiful images that we get from satellites that are all cleaned up and make the Earth look so shining and bright and remove all the cloud cover, that we've forgotten that it's only recently that we've known what it looks like. And even now, very few people have had that experience, and that the experience is presumably, which is one of the things I try to write about, very different from actually seeing photographs of it.
Yeah, what did you find out? That intrigues me, that the experience of actually seeing it is, it's almost become mundane that we see so many pictures of the Earth.
Yes.
What was that first story that you uncovered of those first people that saw it, and was that a life-changing experience for them?
Well, it was for the astronauts, but what was interesting to me was that because I decided to tell a long story from about 1914, when Robert Goddard, the American rocket engineer, took out patents for multi-stage rockets and liquid fuel, and that I was writing about rising above the Earth high enough to see the whole Earth, that it made me think about balloonists and the early aviators, and they had all, and then looking at the astronauts who were the ones who got far enough away, that all of them, even from a mile or two above the Earth, were saying the same thing, that if only everyone could see the Earth from above, that it would change everybody. And certainly the astronauts were saying that. So, but one of the things that came out of my reading was realizing that this had been being said for a couple of 100 years, and it wasn't just about being in space. But certainly, there were 24 people, and, get any group of people, and they all have different experiences. But their doctor, who was called Charles Berry, the Apollo doctor, said that no one who went into space wasn't changed by the experience. I think some of them really don't see what happened to them. And so that I thought was very enlightening, because many of them did change dramatically and change their lives, but some of them tried to deny it. And yet that doctor's remarks kind of encompasses, an outside view could see that it had changed them deeply. And there was another astronaut, Al Bean, who'd said that he thought that everyone who went to the moon came back more like they already were. And I thought that was a very profound thing to say. It's almost like a kind of Buddhist sentiment that, yes, I thought, you can't really change who we are, but you can ideally become more who you are. And that seems to have been what happened to them. A number of them thought, I've got to change my life marriages failed famously. People, many of them left NASA and just wanted to concentrate on living and being, and really making sure that they spent the rest of their lives doing what it was that they really wanted to do. One of them went off in search of Noah's Ark, on Mount Ararat. One of them set up an organization called Noetics to explore consciousness, because he'd had what he described as this experience of being swaddled by the universe, and that he had this sense that the universe was more intelligent than inanimate, and wanted to explore what that was all about. And he also said, actually, that he had the desire to live life to the fullest, to acquire more knowledge. So, yeah, those sort of things that intrigued me.
I don't know if they. Well, I'm sure when President Kennedy made that famous speech in the early '60s that we would put a man on the moon in this decade. I'm sure he understood the power and the impact of that challenge on maybe encouraging, inspiring a generation that we would do the hard things and we would push harder and farther than we ever have before as a species. And we did that. And we accomplished things that it seems like technology just, made an exponential leap. And then we went into the early 70s and all of the moon landings, became more technical, and we put equipment on the moon and all of this sort of things. And then we just stopped.
Yes.
And then we went through the 80s and, with the space shuttle program, but that was all low Earth orbit, type stuff. What happened to us and our drive and determination to keep pushing the boundaries?
Well, there was something, partly one could blame Kennedy and one could praise him. I find his statement incredibly moving, in particular the part of that sentence you were quoting about not just landing a man on the moon, but bringing him safely back again. And it was in that idea of safety that I think somehow something wonderful about Apollo, because it almost all went wrong right at the beginning with Apollo 1 when 3 men died. But they really learned their lesson, and they sort of reorganized the whole way they did things, and safety became paramount. And it's one of the things that slightly distresses me about programs like SpaceX, where we talk about going to Mars and people voluntarily sign up for one-way tickets and death, where the primacy of life was what that mission was about. And I think we don't have a goal. We no longer, because the moon was a goal, we no longer understand what kind of goal we want out of space exploration, I think. I think just saying we want to go to Mars is not in itself enough. I think we need to think about the whole idea of learning more about the Earth and ourselves. So it's about, and this is something I try to write about in the book, that it's something that Charles Lindbergh, who was one of the main characters in my book, and Wernher von Braun, the architect of the Saturn V rocket that got the men to the moon, understood, which was that technology is all very well, but it can become dangerous and destructive if there isn't also wisdom. And so these were 2 men who, in the second half of their lives, kind of devoted a large part of their time to reading poetry and Buddhism and Christian texts, or whatever they could lay their hands on. And this, I find, is kind of missing from our dialogue these days about going into space. I don't think we really, truly have a prophet of who's telling us why now, and what are we going to do it for. I kind of despair slightly when people say, oh, we're destroying this planet, and so we've got to kind of get ready for living somewhere else. Well, perhaps so, but can we transplant ourselves? And perhaps this is one of the main reasons for looking at ourselves from the outside and going into space and trying to build life elsewhere, not to think that we have to, but because it might make us understand more about why we're so integrated into the planet that we currently live on and how we might go about using the technology we use to leave it in order to understand more about how we can stay, if that makes sense.
Well, and if we don't learn how to behave ourselves with with the planet that we live on and with one another, if we transplant to Mars, we're just going to carry those same bad habits and bad behavior, and we're going to wreck another place.
Yeah, I was just reading Ibsen, and he had this wonderful quote just this morning. I was reading it. He was saying about revolution is all very well, but we can't. We're never going to move to the next phase of humanity if it's just about economic revolution. It has to be a revolution of the human mind, and I don't think we're there yet. I don't think there's enough discussion about wisdom. We haven't got any wiser since the ancient Greeks, but we need to tie that wisdom and technology together, in ways that I don't think we're really addressing. I think science, and this is one of the things that fascinates me about going to the moon, and what happened was that in 1968, when those first images came back of the Earth rising over the horizon of the moon, they had the most extraordinary sensational effect on people back on Earth. And for a moment, there was a lot of discussion about here might be a chance to bring science and the spiritual together in a new way, a new kind of religion for the modern age, but it didn't happen. And perhaps it's still a slow process that was kick-started then. Perhaps too early to tell, I don't know.
Right. Christopher, what do you make of the recent story, and you mentioned SpaceX a minute ago. A couple of weeks ago, when we were recording this, they launched the Falcon Heavy, which was the largest rocket in production now, but still not as big as the Saturn V, which you mentioned Werner von Braun developed to that took us to the moon. And all over social media for a couple of days, people were just going nuts with excitement. That they had launched this rocket, and then Elon Musk and his great marketing mind, shot his own car into space. And people were just excited for the first time in a long time. What do you make of this new reinvigorated excitement? And do you think it's going to have legs?
Well, of course, I would be crazy to say I wasn't excited. I was thrilled. The hairs went up on the back of my neck particularly when the two side rockets came. I couldn't believe they were going to land on those two crosses.
Right?
Absolutely synchronized fashion. But it also amused me that we had to talk about Falcon Heavy being the largest functional rocket or whatever, because we had to exclude Saturn V from almost 50 years ago, which was, I don't know how many, X number of times more powerful. But and it's unusual that technology goes backwards in that way. And that was actually the other side of what I was going to say about President Kennedy, I didn't actually get onto, I forgot. There's that the downside of going to the moon was that it cut out all the other projects. That hadn't been NASA's original intention. It wasn't just going to be about the moon. It was about space stations and way stations on the way to Mars and building things on the moon and whatever. But Kennedy, it was made very political, and so it became highly focused on that one mission. And almost the moment after Apollo 11 and the moon landing, the public, and this is, again says something about human nature, we became bored. We moved on to the next thing. There was no plan even to broadcast the launch of Apollo 13, and it was only because things went wrong that the public became so interested in that project. And then again by Apollo 15, loss of interest and a kind of loss of goal. Again, the mission had really been accomplished. We'd got to the moon. Nobody was really that interested in collecting rocks and trying to work out how the moon had been formed. So I think, it comes back to what I was saying before, that we need a kind of philosophical mission statement, I think, for the future, for us to get interested in doing this again.
Right. I think we easily forget that NASA was really used as a pawn in the Cold War.
Yeah.
And once we beat the Russians there, the interest waned and we moved to another battlefront.
Yeah, of course. And we forget that actually we won the moon race in our own terms, in a way. I mean, yes, the Russians were taking part in that and they failed, but they weren't as interested once Khrushchev was out of power. And we have to remember that they were doing other things that were ahead of the rest of the world, like they were the first to have a space station, and they were the first to get to other planets, So they were still being first in other things. They had other, one could say, slightly wider goals, possibly. And when we lost the plans for Saturn V, originally there were going to be 100 of them. I think that in the end there were only 13 that were ever used, and certainly 100 were never built. We had to use Soyuz to get to the space station. ISS, we can only get there through Russian rockets.
Crazy thing to think of.
Yes.
Christopher, the book, there it is full of photographs, illustrations, but every chapter is just filled with this great visual information that really highlights where the story is going at that time. Where did you get all of the supplemental material for the book?
There's so much stuff on history of aviation and astronauting that it wasn't that difficult. And I have to say that one of the wonderful things about NASA is that it's always made everything available to the public. So the resources are incredible. And in a way, it's more to do with limiting your own kind of applying some kind of imagination and filter to it. So again, as I was saying before, I try to find sometimes more unusual images. And I wanted to have images. I thought that was something early on I thought was important, to see how quickly from the first liquid-fueled rocket that was launched in 1926 and traveled about, 126 feet or something, to 42 years later and Saturn V, how in that shortest period, the incredible leap that we made in technology, and to think that in a similar period, we've only gone from Saturn V to Falcon Heavy is kind of, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's we know that technologies happen so exponentially when you think of the iron compared to rotary phone, but when you look at the rockets, not so much.
The book is called The Earth Gazers, on seeing ourselves. Christopher, this book, for anyone who loves science and loves the human progress and looks to the future, I think this book is essential reading, and is an essential volume to have on your shelf. If people are just getting familiar with you and your work, where can they find you to kind of follow along with what's going on with you?
I have a web page, so I'm not very good at keeping it up to date. I mean, I can give you my email address, or do you mean something like that? I mean,
sure. However, people could contact you, or just follow along with new news of what's going on with you. Well,
I love to get emails from people. So my email address is just christopherpotter.co.uk. And I have a web address which is christopherpotter.co.uk, so I can be found there too. So.
Wonderful. Christopher, we're going to send everybody to pick up a copy of the new book. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
No, thank you. It's been great talking to you. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
They reverently slipped Jason's giant-size X-Men #1 from its mylar protector. Drinking in the sweet aroma of browning paper and 3-color process, that signals only the best and rarest and most wonderful of collectibles. On one page, Professor X raised his fingers to his temples and rallied his X-Men, his psychic commands radiating from his bald head like waves off hot asphalt. "I have psychic powers," Owen blurted. "I want Wolverine's claws." Jason was turning a page. "Snicked! Or, hey, get this. Lightsabers poking out the backs of my hands. Or even, no, I'm totally serious. I have psychic powers." "No, you don't." "I do." Jason laid the comic on the bedspread. He sighed. Owen could be such a spaz sometimes. "Okay," he said indulgently. "What number am I thinking of?" "Stop! It doesn't work that way. What I can do is called a psychic reading, off an object, like getting impressions. When the doorbell rings, if I put my hand on the knob, as soon as I do, I know who's there." "It's called looking through the peephole, moron." "Shut up! And when I touch the phone, I know who's calling." "I'm sure, Mr. Bullshit from Bullshit Mountain. Like my sister or my grandmother, I just know it's them." "There's no such thing as psychics." "Okay, you try." "Don't be stupid." "Are you chicken?" "Fine." "Okay." He snatched up a brown paper bag, spotted with grease, and dumped a few stale French fries into the trash can. "I'll put an object in this bag, and you try to guess what it is. Turn your back." Jason did, and heard a rustling behind his head. "Okay, you can look now." Owen produced the bag. It was rounded with some object now. "Don't touch yet, just think. Try to imagine what's inside." "Your lunch?" Jason sneered, but he closed his eyes and tried to imagine. He could hear Owen's breathing. Jason's nose itched. His brain grew bored with nothing to look at, and fragments of images swam in and out of his imagination. "Strawberry," he blurted. Owen reached into the bag, producing a white bowl. Jason had eaten Frosted Flakes from it about 3 days ago. A few stuck to it, like little beige fish scales. "See? I lose." "No, look here." Owen pointed. A design went around the sides of the bowl. A long string of vines and painted fruit. With strawberries. "That's," Jason began, but didn't know how to end the sentence. "It's cool. See? What did I tell you? Do it again." Jason closed his eyes. An image like daisies and sun and yellow, he blurted after 3 seconds. "Oh my God, open your eyes." Owen held a bright yellow highlighter pen. "I hadn't even put it in the bag." And so they went, for 30 minutes or more. A staple remover, a toy soldier, a sweat sock, a pencil. Jason never said precisely what was in the bag, but it was always close or related. He'd imagine a cockpit, and Owen would produce a game controller. He'd say plate, and the object would be a CD. He made right angles with his pointer fingers, shrugging, only to have Owen pull out Eliza's knitting needles. His friend became more and more enthusiastic, but Jason became a little scared. "You have a real gift," Owen said. "You're like brilliant." Owen babbled for a long time about astral projection and ESP, how Jason was picking up signals from Owen's own psychic powers, which had obviously been doing the broadcasting. Owen left that night full of plans and experiments, vindicated in his beliefs. Jason sat on the bed after Owen left, thinking hard. He had no explanation for what he'd done, but he knew he hadn't faked it. He couldn't believe, but he couldn't deny either.